Today we are finishing our study of 1 Peter, and I don't know how long this has felt for everyone who has been hearing it, but this is now our 7th week in our study of 1 Peter. And if it feels that long, don't tell me. But what we've been doing is a medium pace, methodical look at 1 Peter, which begins with 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1, which says this. And if you're following along in the blue Bible, that's going to be on page 588. 588. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 says this. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Peter's writing to these Christians, and he calls them exiles of the dispersion, not because they have been physically displaced to a new home, but because as Christians they are being displaced in the environment in which they lived. They are outsiders in their own countries because of their faith in Jesus. Well, this becomes a great teaching point for Christians as Christianity itself becomes outsiders in society, if you will. That the beliefs, the core beliefs in Jesus are pushed ever more to the margins. How do you live as exiles? So we've been studying 1 Peter with that lens. And as it has been a textual study, I will also tell you that ahead of this, I wrote what I call a one-sheet. A one-sheet of the series, which outlines the titles of each lesson, the text that it will cover, and essentially the application that I want to get to. I will also tell you how many of those changed. Because I would get to the text and thought, by the way, that seemed like a great idea, but I don't feel like it well represents this text. Well, the same is true for today, and my goal is going to be to honor the text and what it says, rather than the good idea I thought I had. So I'll tell you about the lesson that I was going to give for this week, for this text. 1 Peter chapter 5 ends in a rather odd collection of things to talk about, because he begins by addressing elders, shepherds, overseers of the church. Same role, talking about the elders that traditionally govern an individual church. And after he gets done talking about the shepherds, he starts talking about Satan as a lion. So, the title of the lesson, Lions and Shepherds. I was going to begin this lesson with David and Goliath, who was the shepherd who killed a lion to defend the sheep, and I was going to tell you why shepherds are so important for a church. Now, I still believe that that is entirely true, that shepherds are vitally important for a church, especially as Richard was praying in our opening prayer this morning. And I think he was praying it because we've got a men's business meeting later on today. He said, Lord, help us as men to make decisions in lieu of elders, because we don't have them right now. And what a great prayer to have. And yes, please pray that what transpires in men's business meetings is pleasing to God and worthy of his wisdom. But it just shows, therefore, that our church is not in the position that biblically it should be, to have elders presiding over it. And so I want to tell you, yes, elders are important, and elders are important because lions are roaming. There is a danger present for which shepherds can be an answer. However, as I was reading the text today, I realized that there is a greater theme than shepherds and lions. And therefore, it's what I want to share with you today. What I want to share with you is an exile's humility. It is with a plea to humility that Peter ends his book, and that's what I want to share with you today. So if you go to 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 1, 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 1, here's what it says. So I exhort the elders among you as fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Now, I'm sure that you might very well have just keyed in on the three things that Peter uses as foundational for his appeal. His very own resume, that he is a fellow elder, commissioned by Jesus in John chapter 21 to feed the sheep, or that he is a witness of the sufferings of Christ, or that he is also a partaker in the glory that is to be revealed. And that's how he begins this. But maybe you very well flew past the first word. So what? Peter sees this last exhortation as a culmination of what he has said so far. Now, commentaries are pretty divided because people are kind of shooting in the dark. So what? What's the connection there? What does un in Greek mean? And that's what they debate over. And yet what I want to show you is that this plea for humility is a crucial ending for the themes that he has discussed so far. In fact, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you those themes, 3 themes that immediately bridge the previous text and our current one. But these themes cover the whole book. I'm just doing this for brevity's sake. But I want to show you 3 themes that connect these. And the first is the theme of suffering. If you go to chapter 4 and verse 12, Chapter 4, verse 12 says this: "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you, as though something strange were happening to you." He says in verse 13, "But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings." And then he says in verse 16, he says, "Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed." And then in verse 19, he says, "Therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." So that's when he gets into this section. But I want you to see where he continues sufferings. He says, "So I exhort the elders among you, as fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ." And then in verse 9, he says, "Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing the same kind of sufferings are being experienced by the brotherhood throughout the whole world." Verse 10, "And after you have suffered for a little while." And then finally in verse 13 he says, "So she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen." He sees this culmination, or this is the culmination of the exile theme and the suffering it is included over the course of the whole book. The themes connect. But then there's the theme of the coming. In chapter 4, verse 13, I want you to notice with me how he describes the coming of Jesus. Here's what he says: "Rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, so that you may rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed." Verse 17 says, for it is the time for judgment to begin at the household of God." He speaks of judgment. Chapter 5, verse 1, again speaks of Jesus coming when he says, "As well as a partaker of the glory that is to be revealed." Chapter 5, verse 4, it says, "And when the chief shepherd appears, an unfading crown of glory, or you will receive an unfading crown of glory." And then chapter 5, verse 6, when it says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you." Peter is rooting his argument in the sufferings of Christ, the sufferings the Christians are experiencing, and the hope of Christ's coming again, and the glory that comes with it. This section is saturated with conversations about being glorified or exalted. In all of this, I don't think that this is an unnatural jump from chapter 4 to chapter 5. When I first read it, I'll tell you that, you're reading along and he's talking about sufferings and the judgment beginning with the household of God, and to get to, "So I exhort the fellow elders among you," kind of feels like you tripped over a curb. How did that get there? But I want to tell you that this is the absolute necessary conclusion for what he's been talking about. And here's therefore his theme. As he says, "So I exhort the elders among you." Read with me, continuing in chapter 5 and following. Chapter 5, verse 1 and following. "So I exhort the elders among you, as fellow elder and the witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as the partaker that is in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. Did you notice the theme? You might have, especially because I gave it to you as the title of this lesson, and Exile's humility. But let me connect some dots real quick. He tells the elders not to be domineering, but rather being an example. Here in this passage, he's telling the elders, just like we were talking about in class earlier today, that it is not the job of the leader to simply hold position and authority. It is the job of the leader to serve. And that's what makes one great in the kingdom of God. That's what he's encouraging the elders here. And I'll have you note, by the way, because it becomes more explicit in the further sections, that in verse 5, he also begins it by saying likewise. He's given an exhortation to the elders. Now he's going to give an exhortation to the whole church. And as he gives that exhortation to the whole church, he says, by the way, I'm pointing back. You're supposed to be just like the elders in this. And that's when he tells them, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. Again, this is an exercise in humility. I'll point to the last one, which is chapter 5, verse 6, when he speaks to all Christians, saying, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. And sitting nestled in the middle of that is Proverbs chapter 33, or Proverbs chapter 3, verse 34, in the Septuagint, in which reads, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I'll tell you that this sermon today therefore came from the fact that I kept reading this and thinking, that's what this text is about. That is the twine that ties all of this text together and ties the whole book together as well. So today I want to encourage you to exercise humility. And we're going to do so from 3 sections in the text. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, speaking of elders. Chapter 5, verse 5, speaking of the church. And chapter 6 and following, speaking of the Christians. So that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to answer the question, why is humility the answer? Why is humility the culmination of this book? And we'll ask it first concerning the elders. Read with me chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. So I exhort the elders among you, as fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as partaker in the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. In this passage, he is writing to the elders, the men who are supposed to be overseeing and leading and protecting a church. And I want to see in that the kind of leader that he is encouraging them to be. And to do that, I want to note something about shepherds real quick. And that is that in this text, there's 3 times he points to the fact that the shepherds, the flock is not yours. I want you to notice chapter 5, verse 2, when he says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. These are his sheep. The church is not beholden to, belonging to the leaders of the group. They are God's flock. And then I'll point out to you when he says in chapter 5, verse 2 also, he says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. The manner in which they lead is also contingent on the desires of God. And finally, I love this in chapter 5, verse 4, when he says, and when the chief shepherd appears. you will receive an unfading crown of glory. Do you know what I get from this? About the kind of leadership that the church requires, therefore the kind of leader for which this church is looking? Shepherds are stewards. Shepherds recognize, I'm not in charge. I'm not in authority, if you will. I am serving on behalf of the one who is greater than me. There's a chief shepherd. These are God's flocks, and I need to do it as He would have me. And that requires a lot of humility. I think that's the reason why when Paul describes the work of an elder, he says that he not be puffed up. You can't have this attitude of stewardship and be arrogant at the same time. Church leaders should always be one who submit the most, who are servants the most, who are the most humble. I'll have you note, by the way, that in the text of the Old Testament, I think this is in Deuteronomy, that describes Moses as the most humble man. I will have you therefore note that Moses is a great example of what it means to be a shepherd and a leader. He spent the first 40 years in his life in Egypt, and by the end of that first 40 years, when he killed the Egyptian, he thought that everything that he had done in training and studying under the tutelage of pharaohs prepared him to be a leader. But he wasn't ready yet. And so God, after that first 40 years, sent him out in the wilderness for 40 years to go be a shepherd of flocks, and then to come back. And the way that he describes leading the people is leading them in and leading them out like a shepherd would his people or his flock. Shepherds are always stewards, and that's the kind of leader, the kind of humility that is required for this office. But I'll also note this. He, in the next few verses, gives a contrast of the way that an elder is supposed to lead, the way that a shepherd is supposed to act. And he keeps it under not and but. Here's what he says. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly. Not domineer, or as willingly as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being an example to the flock. Or being examples to the flock. I've always used to feel like this was a preacher joke until I actually went and started working with livestock. Do you want to know the difference between a cowboy and a shepherd? If you want to move cows, you get behind them and you scare them, and they run. Cows are really good at that. But therefore, what's that picture of a cowboy? He's on the back of a horse with a whip, driving behind it. Shepherds, however, don't walk behind the flock. They walk in front of it, and they lead. And it is a gentle voice and a calling that has that flock leading or following. I really get that as the picture of not domineering, but being an example. The kind of leader that churches require, the kind of leader that Peter is exhorting the church and what it needs, even in times of suffering, even in times of the hope of glory, if you will, is the kind of leader that is humble enough to lead by example, eagerly, willingly. But let's answer the question, therefore, from this text. Why is humility the answer for elders to lead the church the right way? And at the culmination of this letter, the church is going to need the right kind of leadership. And so he exhorts the elders among them. But then he turns in verse 5. And in verse 5, he turns his attention toward the church, specifically their relationship to the elders. Here's what he says. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And I want you to notice that when he talks about the younger, the church in general, he's actually going to identify three relationships here. First, he says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. I use shepherds here, same term, or same office. So he says, be subject to the shepherds, be subject to the elders. And by the way, I have seen where this is crucially important. Because I've seen the opposite. I have seen the churches where the people thought, these elders are doing a terrible job, but I know how to do this better. And the destruction that happens after that. There's a reason why Peter gives this exhortation, being subject to the elders in humility. But he gives this second relationship too. Be subject to the elders, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. Our general attitude about the church should be one of humility. Our general posture should be one of service and kindness and love, coming from this humility. But the third relationship that he offers is, for God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. You cannot have a right relationship with the shepherds. You cannot have a right relationship with one another. You cannot have a right relationship with God without humility. So why is humility the answer for the church? To promote peace in the church. And unless we have that, the very comparison that we were talking about, the very envy that we were talking about, the very sense of attention-seeking that we were describing earlier, is that which contaminates the group and leads to the same factions that Peter was mentioning. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. No. To promote peace in the church, humility will always be the answer. And then finally, he offers it to all Christians. Here's what he says. Verse 6. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Stop. Can I just say that might be one of the most comforting verses in all of Scripture? Casting your anxieties on him because he cares for you. But there's a reason for that context. He says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the whole world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen. Here's why he notes the reason why we must be humble, and humble to God. He said, there's a lion walking around. My boys love going to the zoo. The Birmingham Zoo here. They can tell you the exact name of the lion that is at the zoo. Do you know? No, what's the name of the lion at the zoo? Yeah, I hate that his name is Josh. But when we were last there, we were sitting outside, and there's a large group of people, and we've been there enough. We've heard every tour guide speak, if you will, every volunteer. And so we felt able to answer when we're listening to this crowd, and they're saying, he needs a companion in there. They need to get a lioness so that he can have someone in there. And unfortunately, the answer to that question was, you know the ending of that story? Yeah, they tried that. They kept him apart for months and months and months. Her life ended in minutes. So as we're sitting back, yeah, I know, right? As we're sitting back, they're saying, oh, he needs a lioness. I'm thinking, I told him, he's not a nice lion. He doesn't need a friend. He needs some solitary confinement, if you will. And when I think of Josh the lion, I think of this verse. He's just looking for someone to devour. When it describes the devil, he's looking for someone as prey. And he attaches that, by the way, if you see immediately afterward when he says, for the same kind of sufferings is experienced by the brotherhood all the way around the world. Satan and the devil is capable of inflicting this kind of suffering all the way around the world. He is looking for someone to devour. And if you are proud, if you are one who is convinced that in your life you deserve more, you deserve better than what the Christians are experiencing, guess what you're going to do? I'm not going to go through that. I'm not going to put up with that. And therefore you soften being a Christian than softening what the devil is trying to do. Humility is the key in all of this. Why is humility the answer for Christians? To resist the devil. And so in this final section, when you put all those three things together, to lead the church well, to create peace in the church, and to resist the devil, here's the final conclusion. Here's what he is showing us to this entire study of exiles. We need each other. We need strong churches. And we need strong churches that are going to help one another, because we are not living in an environment that is safe, but where there's a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Can I give you one final illustration? It's one of my favorite fables from Aesop's Fables. It was of 3 oxen, sometimes called 3 bulls. And in that story, those 3 bulls grazed every day, back to back, right next to each other. And there was a circling lion. But he knew there was no way that he could conquer those 3 bulls. So do you know what he did? He started spreading rumors about each one and causing division between them, so that each of those 3 bulls started grazing alone. The lion devoured all 3 of those oxen. When there's a roaring lion, the strongest thing you need is each other. When there's a roaring lion, the strongest thing that we need is churches. And the only thing that keeps churches healthy is humility. This, I believe, is why Peter ends his study on exiles with a call to humility. That we would have the general disposition of kindness, of submission, of gentleness towards one another. Because that's what creates the kind of churches that are going to be able to stand being exiles.